Let's talk about venerating the Dark Gods with a new Chaos Space Marine army, with an overview of collecting the faction in Warhammer 40K 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Chaos Space Marines. In this video I thought it was high time to update the Start Collecting video for 10th edition. Now we've got a nice new shiny codex for the Legions of the Dark Gods. In the video we'll talk about why you might want to collect a Chaos Space Marine army in the first place, a bit of heretical research and planning that you might want to do once you've settled on the faction, and a few ideas as to first purchases and expanding the army after that. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight into it. First up, why might you want to collect Chaos Space Marines in the first place? Starting with the faction's lore, the Chaos Marines are genetically augmented super soldiers in power armor, much like their loyalist brothers, though the bulk of their forces represent the legions that turned against the Emperor during the Horus Heresy, most fighting and being defeated, cast back into the Eye of Terror for millennia, though thanks to the machinations of Abaddon the Despoiler's 13th Black Crusade, the Eye of Terror split asunder, and Chaos Space Marines are free to operate far more widely in the galaxy, often using bases within the Cicatrix Maledictum to strike out at both sides of the Imperium. Chaos Space Marines gain a whole load of character from their Legion traits and the warbands that they form. Given the amount of material and flavour their archetypes have from all the Horus Heresy lore, they've got better developed sub-factions than virtually any of the other armies in Warhammer 40k, all with their own distinct fighting styles, personality, and aesthetics. When they take to the battlefield, they bring all the fury of standard Space Marine war gear with things like bolters, chainswords, and various standard bits of Astartes kit, plus things like hulking possessed, demon engines, blessings from the Chaos Gods, and unnatural sorcery, to lay low the followers of the Corpse Emperor in the name of the true powers. Miniatures-wise, the Chaos Space Marines are fairly well established within Warhammer 40k as quite a big faction. They've got a pretty large miniature range as one of 40k's oldest armies, with lots of themes having been developed for them, and quite a lot of their core kit offerings with their standard infantry have been redone over the past 5 years or so. They got a big release in 8th edition, and quite a bit more in 9th. There are still a few older relic models in the range, particularly the bikers perhaps stand out as being several eras before some of the other stuff. A few of the tanks are a bit dated as well, but kind of hold up, given that fine detailing usually isn't as big a deal for those. This heavy weapon Havoc Marine sports a few of their common tropes, lots of trim on the miniatures, and plenty of spikes and chaos symbols all over their armour, plus the occasional mutations here and there. Perhaps slightly busy models for the most part, at least compared with the Loyalists, and in terms of support for the individual legions, they don't really have loads in current 40k. The deity-specific legions, things like World Eaters or Thousand Suns and the like, they have their own miniature ranges, but a lot of the more Chaos Undivided style legions from the core codex don't have as much support. A few things can be found from things like third-party makers, or from the Horus Heresy range though, where a few things that work with their kits back in the Horus Heresy can add a bit of a flair and theming for one legion in the current 40k setting. For a few examples of their model range, here on the left we have some standard Legionaries, the foot troops of the Dark Gods, armed with bolters, chainswords, and a variety of heavy and special weapons. On the top right we have a Venom Crawler Demon Engine, a beacon of souls and psychic energy that feeds on the enemy. In the centre we've got Abaddon the Despoiler, architect of the Black Crusades and the destruction of the Cadian Gate. He's taken up the mantle of War Master from his Primarch forebear, and is tireless in his striving to bring the Imperium to its knees once and for all. There's far more though. We've got some cultists on the left, mortal followers to accompany your Chaos Space Marines into battle and be used as grunt troops and cannon fodder. A sinister possessed warp talon in the middle, able to claw their way in and out of reality and descending from the skies on shrieking jump packs. There's a Vindicator on the top right, a siege tank employed equally by the Loyalists and the Heretics, a demolisher cannon capable of destroying the hardest of the enemy armour, and on the bottom right we've got a Demon Prince, a Chaos Lord that has pleased the Dark Gods adequately to reward him with the undying gift of demonhood. Unfortunately, there's not that much representation for the individual legions in the Warhammer 40k plastic kits at the moment. One of the only things is this Night Lord's Kill Team kit. That's basically some Legionaries with some snazzy extra winged helmets and other Night Lord's trappings. Hopefully they do a few more like this in the future. Otherwise, as mentioned, you can dig into the Horus Heresy range a bit from Forge World. They do tend to be more expensive than regular 40k plastics, which is kind of saying something, but they do have some cool miniature sculpts, such as this Alpha Legion Praetor here. Generally speaking though, I'd rate the pricing for the Chaos Space Marines as not too bad by general 40k standards. They tend to be one of the slightly cheaper armies to collect just because they have a fair amount of points in the box for a fair few of their miniatures, although they don't tend to have quite as many discount offerings versus the Loyalist Space Marines, unfortunately. They're certainly not the worst in 40k though. Finally, when putting miniatures on the table, Chaos Space Marines have some pretty fun rules to go at in game. The rules are now from the somewhat recently released Codex Chaos Space Marines. That represents the core of the more undivided Chaos Legions. The deity-specific ones these days get their own separate indexes and then codexes. In-game classification, now having Death Guard or World Eaters is a different army to core Chaos Space Marines. Within the Codex though, they get some fun rules. I really do quite like their Dark Pacts core special rule. This one means each time that your models attack the enemy, you can choose to invoke a Dark Pact. You've got the chance of taking some mortal wounds, but then either their attacks get lethal hits or sustained hits. It just makes Chaos Space Marines a pretty dangerous army altogether. If you fail a leadership test though, you take D3 mortal wounds. The blessings of the Dark Gods often come with a sinister price. Beyond that, they have quite a lot of representation and warriors that fight both at range and in melee. Perhaps compared with the Loyalists, they have had a bit more of a slant towards melee close combat versus ranged warfare, though they can absolutely do well with both with their tanks and demon engines in 10th. Currently power-wise, they're initially looking quite strong with their codex coming out, though it remains to be seen how they're going to shape up against other tournament lists. I feel like they've done well enough with the detachments, with some themed ones to match a bunch of legions and a few other playstyles. I'll talk through a few of those in a bit, but I feel like the Codex was one of the better ones out of 10th edition so far. Overall, if you want a twisted force of sinister space marines laying low the forces of the Corpse Emperor for the False Gods, and doing so with some pretty fun and destructive gameplay rules, then the Chaos Space Marines might be the army for you. Moving forward, if you do decide to collect Chaos Space Marines, then there's certainly a fair bit of planning that you can do before you actually start to get miniatures bought or on the table. Picking up the Codex isn't the worst place to start in the world. That will get you the unit profiles, rules, and a fair bit of lore and miniature galleries, so it's a fairly good central tome for starting the army. You can find an awful lot of information just free and online though. For gameplay rules, you can look at things like Battlescribe, New Recruit, and Warhapedia, or Games Workshop's app. All of those can give you a bit more of a grasp of the faction mechanics of the army, and it can be nice to experiment with a few army lists just to see what sort of army that you could have in practice. For the lore of the legions, the Chaos Space Marines are perhaps one of the best developed armies in Warhammer 40k in terms of big dramatic backstories and fully fleshed out characters. Games Workshop's gone into them in enormous depth in the Horus Heresy book series in particular, giving you a good understanding of where the legions have come from, and having far more nuanced and deep characters than many of the other races in 40k and their sub-factions. Otherwise, there's absolutely loads that you can imbibe with just following along with social media. Here on YouTube there's a lot. I've made a Chaos Space Marine Codex overview and a Choose Your Legion video. I'll link both of those down in the video description, and there'll certainly be more to come on that front, including a unit tier list, and I'm hopefully going to do a few Legion specific videos as well. There's massive amounts of stuff on other channels as well, battle reports to see them in action, painting guides, and all sorts of lore videos. Just watching a few hours of Chaos Space Marine related content can have you imbibe a lot. Otherwise, I'd likely recommend following along with a few heretical social media pages. Most of the big factions in Warhammer 40k have their own Discord servers, Facebook groups, and subreddits. All of those can be quite good to get painting inspiration and just ask a few basic questions to people who are already in the hobby, and just get a general feel for the community with a few of the questions they're asking and the things that they're focusing on. Focusing back on the army building specifically, it's probably worth starting to plan out an 1,000 point or 2,000 point army list at some time fairly early in the process. Basically deciding what sort of Chaos Space Marine army you want, whether you're going for a balanced and well-rounded collection to serve the Dark Gods well, maybe with a few infantry, some demon engines, some tanks and leaders, or whether you're going to try and take your Chaos Space Marines down a certain theme of one sort or another, either building around something specific in the gameplay, like a specific detachment, or trying to take the units that work well, or trying to build up a really lore-themed force that builds around a certain legion and the units that they're most well known for. Give them some snazzy paint jobs and some character customization, or even designing your own Renegade Chaos Warband from the ground up. You could also shake things up a bit, deciding on whether or not your army is going to be specifically following one of the Chaos deities individually, or going for central Chaos undividers, or if you want a force that more focuses on ranged warfare and heavy firepower versus tearing up the enemy with mutations and chainswords in close. Chaos Space Marines can do allies rather well as well. They are the army that perhaps has the access to the most of them out of virtually anything in 40k. You can take summon demons, allied chaos knights, And cult marines like Khorne Berserkers and Plague Marines, they do have a lot of options for other things that you can add outside of the Codex if you'd like. For the Chaos Legions themselves, as mentioned, I have made an entire video about these. Everyone with the Dour and Firepower Heavy Iron Warriors in their metallic and hazard striped armour, to the frothing zealots of the Word Bearers, evangelising the Dark Gods to all that will listen, and converting the masses to reject the lies of the false Emperor. There's loads of lore and theming to go at, and Games Workshop have deliberately made it so the detachments aren't necessarily 100% tied to the legions. So you could have an Alpha Legion army and vary up how you play them from game to game, though each of them do have a sort of themed detachment that might be a bit more in line with how they might play in the lore. Talking of those, there's a big 8 detachments here with their rough Legion theming and a few things that they focus on. We've got things like the Deceptors for the duplicitous Alpha Legion, with infiltrating a bunch of cultists and Legionaries into the midboard. Renegade Raiders for the fast-moving and hard-hitting Renegade warbands like the Red Corsairs. Chaos Cult for flooding the Void with vast amounts of mutant and mortal followers. Or the dreaded Veterans of the Long War focusing on Black Legion proficiency. None of these lock out any units, so you could take any individual combination of units in any one of them. And I would say that Games Workshop have done these quite well. Quite a lot of them do seem like they've got interesting and impactful rules, even if they're not all super strong. There are quite a few credible general purpose ones here that you could use with a balanced list and swap out from one to the other if you wanted to play different games. Most of them do at least have some focus on certain units being a little bit better in them versus others, maybe most notably some of the more unit-locked ones like the Soulforged War Pack, which is the Vashtor-themed one. That's all about the demon engines and making them frighteningly dangerous, and it does mean that collecting to one of these detachments might lead you down a few choices more so than others. At first impressions, my guesses would be that the Renegade Raiders, the Soulforged War Pack, and maybe the Pact-bound one look like some of the more interesting ones for competitive play. I'd say the majority of them have at least something interesting to draw you to them though. Probably the Chaos Cult one is perhaps the most restrictive and feels like it doesn't have enough raw power to really make itself felt, so a bit more for fun and fluff games for that rather than strength. At this point it's probably worth thinking about painting up a test model as well to get a colour scheme worked out. For this one, as per usual, I'd likely go for a standard infantry model, most likely a Chaos Legionary, just as that's going to have the common themes across quite a lot of other Chaos Space Marines, their standard armour colours, plenty of their customary trim, some flesh tones, mutated bits, and weapons as well. Much better to get the scheme worked out on a small and slightly lower investment model than really big characters or vehicles. In general, Chaos Space Marines do take a bit longer to paint versus most miniatures if you're trying to execute the same things on the box art. The main issue is that they're quite detailed with a lot of trim on a bunch of the armour plates. So on the Black Legion it's the black armour with the gold trim around, plus even on that a bunch of finer detail including the armour trying to grow some horns and teeth as you do. As a result, for some miniatures it's genuinely easier to spray on the trim colour and block out the armour plates. Say for example you might consider that for the Helldrake. A well-painted Chaos army like this can look super nice, but it can take a bit more time than some miniature factions out there, and I would bear in mind that there are some colour schemes for Chaos in the lore that have the armour and the edge bits all painted the same colour. Could be genuinely worth considering something like that, like maybe the scheme for the Purge for example, if you do want to speed things up a bit and get miniatures on the table quicker. As ever, there's loads of good painting guides online and here on YouTube. Games Workshop have plenty of their own, but there's loads from other creators. Just type in any Legion's paint scheme and you'll no doubt get a whole bunch of creators show various different ways to execute it. My usual advice is that if you're newer to painting, then pick one that you think you can execute all right and follow along. You absolutely don't need to stick to the prescribed Legion colours though. You can put your own twist on them and say they're a warband out of the Legion, or just completely make up your own Chaos mini faction. It's been a long 10,000 years since the Horus Heresy, and there's all sorts of dark corners of the galaxy where heretic Astartes might have become isolated or turned traitor from various chapters out there. Getting on to the fun bit though, let's talk miniatures. Currently if you're going with Games Workshop plastics, I'd most likely start with one of these kits, either Combat Patrol Chaos Space Marines or the box of Chaos Legionaries. Plenty of other ways that you could start of course, though I feel like either a bit of rank and file troops or the discount box for the faction aren't the worst options if you're starting out from a standing start. Beyond this, I'd usually prioritise anything else that you feel particularly compelling or have really drawn you to collect the faction. Always good to have a bit of motivation for getting your rank and file on the tabletop to go to the next big thing. And for gameplay purposes, maybe some heavy damage dealers to make sure you can handle enemy heavy armor and elites. That often tends to be a weakness for people starting out collecting 40k armies, having a bunch of things that can damage enemy infantry, but not enough anti-armor specialists. Starting out, let's take a look at Combat Patrol Chaos Space Marines. This is the new one for 10th edition, and it's got a Master of Possession leading 5 Possessed, 10 Legionaries, and 10 Cultists. Games Workshop's Combat Patrol boxes are £95, €125 or $160, though it seems that with the Games Workshop price rises coming shortly, it would appear that they're going up to £100 or $168 on the 10th of June 2024. Combat Patrol boxes give you a discount versus buying the exact same miniatures individually. This one's around about 27% off. I'd say sort of middling for discount, not standout, but not terrible either by Games Workshop's current standards. For points in the box, it can change over time with Games Workshop balance updates, but currently it's around about 405 points. Certainly not the worst out of the Combat Patrols, but also not one of the best either. A few of the units did go down in cost lately. For the most part though, I think that the miniatures contained within are nice enough. It gets you 10 Legionaries, which are just the central foot troops, and pretty nice miniatures. The Cultists and Possessed are fairly recent miniatures from the Games Workshop range. They came out in late 9th edition, and the Master of Possession I think is really quite a fun one, a sort of demon summoning HQ character, and perhaps quite a nice one to get discounted as otherwise he's online only. Current gameplay wise, I'd say the Legionaries are absolutely standout and top tier for Chaos Space Marines, nice to have a fair amount of core troops. Cultists are pretty excellent as a supporting rule. It's really handy to have that sticky objectives type rule that they get in the army, even if they're not going to do much damage. The Possessed are ranked a bit more mid-tier now though. They're fairly cheap and generally quite dangerous to enemy infantry, though they did have a big blow when they moved into the Codex and only get their devastating wound rule once per game. It does just make them a bit less general purpose, bar the main turn that they hit home and trigger it. As it goes though, I think it's a reasonably well-rounded introduction to Chaos Marines. 2 sets of basic troops to fill out the battle line, plus 1 squad of elite damage dealers. As ever with picking up 40k miniatures, bear in mind the different ways in which you can do so. Direct from Games Workshop's Warhammer web store is usually the most reliable, but also the most expensive. If you were going for Games Workshop plastic kits, it usually makes sense to take advantage of online discount retailers in your region who are licensed to sell Warhammer at a 10 to 20% discount below Games Workshop prices. As ever, I have a bunch of those linked in the video description. Element Games in the UK for 15% off, Gap Games in Australia for 21% off, Fenris Workshop in Canada for 10% off, and Wargame Portal in the USA for 15% off. Buying anything after clicking those links does help support Auspex Tactics a little bit, though they don't cost any extra to use, and a big thank you to any of you guys who are using them if you're buying things anyway. There's plenty of other options besides new Games Workshop plastics though. I wouldn't underestimate the second-hand market and think about checking eBay when you're picking up a kit. Quality can of course be very variable with pre-owned miniatures, but you might well be able to get a good deal on the exact thing that you wanted and save yourself a good amount of money and maybe time and modelling effort as well. And these days there's a vast amount of 3D printing and third-party manufacturer alternatives. Loads of great and very heretical looking sculpts out there that could fit the bill as proxy Chaos Space Marines, near equivalent to what Games Workshop makes, but different enough to be legally distinct. I've seen some people using Ravage Star from Mini Wargaming. Though there's a massive amount of third-party alternatives and 3D printed things, easy enough to Google if you just give it a search, and it can be another good source for getting certain parts and weapon options, particularly upgrades for things like Legion-specific aesthetic stuff. Otherwise, besides the Combat Patrol box, as mentioned, one of the kits I'd think about early on would be the standard Legionaries. Maybe if you just wanted to get a unit to dip your toe in the faction rather than jumping in straight away with a big box. There's 2 different kits of these available from Games Workshop, either the more standard Chaos Space Marines one or the Kill Team Legionaries one, which at least at time of recording is £2.50 more or an extra $5, but I think it's the same in euros. That all could change a little bit with the upcoming price increases. I think personally for the difference between the two, I'd probably go with the Kill Team Legionaries one. What it gives you is basically an extra sprue with the chain cannon, great big 2-handed chain axe, plus the balefire tome, a few fun bits really, which I think are probably worth the small price difference. I suspect that even if you just wanted the standard Chaos Space Marine kit, you'd probably be able to sell the Kill Team upgrade sprue for more than the difference on eBay if you had a mind to. For assembling your standard Chaos Space Marines, War Gear is free at the moment in 10th edition, so it makes sense to go for fairly maximal scary stuff. I'd likely take a power fist on the sergeant and the heavy melee weapon chain axe, then either a heavy weapon or special weapon beyond that. Some of the heavy weapons don't actually come in the Legionary kit, so it might not be the worst idea to add a squad of Havocs to the army at some stage in the not too distant future to give you some other fun options like las cannons, which you could fill with Legionaries and give you a bit of flexibility. Otherwise, talking through a few other basic options to expand, there's the Chaos Rhino. These things often tend to be the ride of choice to get Legionaries into battle. A nice, tough, and fast moving battlefield bunker where they can keep safe and then charge out of and hit the enemy very hard with dark packs. For some fast moving jump infantry support, the Warp Talons are rather nice. A whole bunch of power weapon attacks that reroll wound rolls shred enemy infantry rather well. And at least unless they FAQ it or anything, then they've got a rather devastating move where they can jump in, destroy an enemy unit, then go back into Deep Strike Reserve, potentially returning with rapid ingress after that to take out something else with very little that your opponent can do much about it. They're really powerful currently, though there is a chance that that might get toned down. Otherwise, for some armor busting, the Vindicator hits enemy tanks and vehicles hard. It's really quite an efficient gunline tank and stays fairly safe behind its siege shield, which allows it to fire in combat. For a commander, for some Chaos Legionaries or Chosen, the Chaos Lord is a rather nice choice. He adds a lot of melee power with one turn of being able to flex into some massive damage, really good with a Demon Hammer or maybe a Power Fist. And as well as this sculpt, there's likely going to be the new Chaos Lord with the multi-parts, released individually in the not too distant future. Otherwise, for some other fighting elites, the Chaos Terminators aren't the worst shout. They often tend to be at least a fairly central unit to the faction, with big defensive profiles and being one of the best things to take good synergies with stratagems and characters quite well. They can also rapid ingress to get them to melee, and you get quite a few points in the box, which is handy for expanding an army towards a big force. And currently both the Forge Fiend and Mauler Fiend are rather nice damage dealers, depending on whether you want close combat or heavy firepower, both threatening enough to be able to give the opponent some serious target priority issues while the rest of your army goes about doing its thing. Finally, one other consideration for trying to get your force to a bigger force as fast as possible are the kits that have the best points cost for the money. I believe at the moment for the Chaos Space Marines that's the Warp Forged and Abaddon the Despoiler. The Warp Forged are a direct only Games Workshop deal, giving you one Venom Crawler and two Obliterators, currently 280 points in game, which really isn't too bad for the money that they cost. And you can order them in from some discount retailers. I believe Wargame Portal in the USA, linked in the video description, do them at discount. Abaddon the Despoiler, the Commander-in-Chief, is a rather nice miniature, who again costs a lot of points for how much the miniature costs in real life. If you are doing a Black Legion army or just want the Despoiler at the head of your force, he might not be the worst pickup with getting your army towards 2,000 points. It's got some fun aura abilities that can really make the centre of an army be spectacularly dangerous as well, never mind his scary melee. Finally, while we're on the subject of expanding options, it's worth bearing in mind the other discount sets that were out there from the past. With the Chaos Space Marine launch in 10th edition, they've had the Veterans of the Long War and the Dread Talons box sets. Both of these Chaos Battle Forces had quite good discounts on the miniatures within, though unfortunately Games Workshop produced very little of them indeed. So if somehow you did manage to find one of these going for some semblance of its original price, it could be a good option. Particularly the Veterans of the Long War one is quite a nice one for people just starting out. Otherwise, for other discount kits you might see around and about, the previous Combat Patrol was alright. This one got you a Hellbrute and Havocs as well as Legionaries and a Dark Apostle. Again, not too unhelpful as units for a starting force. And there's other things from more in the distant past. In 9th edition we had things like the Boarding Patrol with Abaddon the Despoiler in it, or the Balefleet Battle Force. I can't imagine there'd be too many of those around and about now. For a fair few of these, I'd probably only think about them if you can get them for some sort of semblance of their original price. If not, it might just not be worth it versus just getting the exact kits that you do find the most appealing through a discount retailer. Finally, for discount kits, just to talk about another more out there option, you could potentially start an army of Chaos Space Marines via the Warhammer Horus Heresy Age of Darkness box set. This one is one of Games Workshop's biggest and most expensive boxes at £185 or $310, but it does come with the Space Marines contained within, really at quite a good discount for what you get, and some people might like the slightly more clean and sleek aesthetic as opposed to Chaos Marines with all the spikes and mutations and things. For some armies I feel like they work quite well. Maybe armies like Alpha Legion or Iron Warriors aren't the worst for that slightly less busy aesthetic. This one gets you 40 Space Marines with Bolters, 10 Terminators, a Spartan that you could use as a Land Raider in a pinch, and a Contemptor Dreadnought that you could run as a Hellbrute. Could just be one cheaper way to start a force with a more Heresy era armor aesthetic, and might have the side benefit of being able to use these guys into gaming systems as well, which doesn't hurt. Otherwise, just in general, for thoughts on expanding the army, in Warhammer 40k there's always a lot of scope for just collecting what you like the look of, as the game rules and current best thing tends to change over time, and sometimes quite rapidly. I say at time of recording, at least the majority of units in the army are at least in a place where they're usable, as opposed to being completely rubbish. Though as ever, there are still things that are notably stronger or weaker than the bell curve. For most collectors, they'd try and build up a sort of balanced core army and then add in elements that particularly interest you, either through rules and gameplay or because you particularly like the models or they fit your theme. Maybe if you're starting out towards a balanced army of around about 2 or 3,000 points, I'd probably start with a combat patrol or another discount deal if there was one easily available. Maybe build up to add another 10 legionaries perhaps and get some rhinos to transport them. I'd quite like to have some representation for the various flavours of scary elite infantry that Chaos Space Marines can have, maybe at least some possessed, chosen, and terminators in the ranks for various flavours of melee violence. To back that up, I'd quite like something to be able to deal with enemy heavy armour and highly elite troops, some shooty or fighty demon engines to do a bit of heavy lifting, maybe predator tanks, forge fiends, vindicators, or mauler fiends could fit this bill okay. And to back up for some screening and grunt objective work, Chaos Cultists are alright. I feel like it's worth having at least some in an army at the moment for their sticky objectives type rule, and they've often just been useful for very cheap units to do objectives and actions and things without having to dedicate entire squads of Chaos Marines to do that. My usual plan would be to have a rough idea for a 2,000 point army list that you want to work towards, and build towards it in small chunks, getting maybe one kit or a few kits at a time, painting them up and playing games with them, and then moving on to the next. Then when it comes time for your forces to hit the tabletop, as mentioned the rules are contained in Codex Chaos Space Marines in 10th edition, which has the unit datasheets, detachment rules, and the Crusade and Combat Patrol content if you're interested in playing in those game modes. The points costs for the units written in the Codex are a placeholder. The actual true points costs are kept updated in Games Workshop's Monitor and Field Manual, and you can find that in the download section of the Warhammer community webpage to keep up with the current points costs for the faction. Otherwise, for rules access, you could potentially pick up some datasheet cards if you want to. They're sort of handy little flashcards that can give you the unit profiles for quick reference in game. Not really the most essential purchase in the world, though a lot of people do quite like them. And of course, as well as the official way of doing things, there are plenty of non-Games Workshop sources that list the rules as well. Things like Battlescribe, New Recruit, and Warhapedia, keeping up with points costs and unit profiles. Taking a slightly closer look at the rules for the Dark Gods, Dark Pacts is quite an impactful one. The main decision is choosing between lethal hits and sustained hits, and usually in 40k the calculation is fairly simple. If you're wounding the enemy on a 5 plus or worse, lethal hits is better. If you're wounding the enemy on a 4 plus or better, it's usually sustained hits, which might also be the one that you'd think about a bit more if you had, say, devastating wounds, as it allows you to access them. Each time you activate it, you have the chance to take some mortal wounds. You take a leadership test, and if you roll below your leadership, you take D3 mortal wounds, and this happens before you do the damage now, so it could potentially take an unhelpful chunk out of your units before you attack the enemy. It means it's a bit more reliable with some of the units that have inbuilt rerolls for this, say ones with Chaos Icons. I think it's quite a fun and flavourful rule though. Are you daring to ask the Chaos Gods for their favour, as you might not necessarily like all the gifts that they have to offer? For the detachments, I do think that the Chaos Space Marine Codex has a strength in that there's a fair few more general purpose ones that a nice balanced army could credibly use multiple of. I'm not going to go through every single detachment here, but maybe just focus on 3 of the more general purpose ones that you could try out as you're starting out. The Renegade Raiders looks like one of the most interesting and strong at first glance. The assault keywords to get guns into place, and then a nice boosting rule that gives you extra AP against units on objectives, and some really fun stratagems that give you extra mobility and extra damage, both things that are really quite nice to stack on top of Dark Pacts. I feel like they're going to be quite a strong one and could be a good choice for a detachment to go with first. Otherwise, you could go with the more Black Legion themed Veterans of the Long War. These guys basically steal the Oath of Moment special rule from the Loyalist Space Marines and give you some pinpoint damage to utterly ruin one unit. That can be serious damage increases when combined with Dark Pacts. Their stratagems maybe are a little bit more mid, though handy enough, extra mobility and damage dealer type ones, though a couple of their best moves are a bit pricey at 2 CP. Otherwise, you could go with the Pac-Bound Zealots, the new version of the Index one, which I think is certainly still one of the most interesting out of the detachments. You get to mark each one of your Chaos units to one of the 4 deities, and they make your Dark Pacts better for each one. Nurgle, for instance, gives you sustained hits on a 5+ when you're shooting, and that's just enormously powerful for a bunch of ranged units like, say, Chaos Vindicators or maybe Forge Fiends, and back that up with some really interesting and powerful stratagems. Things like Chaos Undivided getting to flatly re-roll the wound roll, which is very scary on things like Chosen or Possessed, or the Nurgle stratagem to prevent the enemy shooting you at long range, which can be really disruptive if you have some of them in your gun line. Finally, just to round up and have one idea for a balanced Chaos Space Marine army list, here's just one idea for what you could achieve with 2,000 points. This one trying to be kind of new player focused, roughly 2,000 points but not 100% exact, and you're building around 2 copies of the Combat Patrol box sets and 1 Warp Forged set to get a whole load of Chaos Space Marines on the board for maybe a little bit cheaper than otherwise. The list is headed up by a Chaos Lord who'll be leading one of the Legionary units, which will be transported to the front in Rhinos, and a Master of Possession leading a great big unit of 10 Possessed, a pretty scary melee squad that should be able to punch through most enemy Space Marine equivalents or hordes, and certainly hit a bit harder in the turn when they have devastating wounds. The Legionaries are organised into 4 small squads of 5, taking 2 heavy melee weapons in each unit. I guess to have them a bit optimised, you might need to try and source a few other bits like some extra power fists or something from somewhere, but it's not the end of the world if a few squads aren't taking the absolute maximal loadout, and they're rolling up the board in some rhinos, being ready to jump out, deal some damage to the enemy with Dark Pacts, and then put some cheap objective control to Chaos Marines on the mid-board objectives. We've got 2 units of Chaos Cultists to mark objectives with the sticky objectives type rule and do grunt work like secondaries. And for a couple more infantry damage dealers, we've got a big squad of 10 Warp Talons to jump in, destroy something, and then ascend to the skies. And a unit of Obliterators for a big deep strike threat. They can potentially drop in and shoot something out of line of sight. Really quite impactful if it's something that the opponent absolutely needed to keep safe. Then for this one, I've gone for a bit of a mix of the more efficient Chaos Tanks and Demon Engines. There's a Venom Crawler for some spammed anti-infantry shots with Strength 6 and Damage 2, a Chaos Vindicator to take out some heavy targets, a Chaos Predator Destructor with Las Cannon sponsons as just a very general purpose gun turret, and a Forge Fiend armed with triple Ectoplasma cannons. They're pretty great against basically anything due to loads of blast keywords and good high strength AP and damage shots. Realistically, I feel like you wouldn't go too far wrong running this in a bunch of different attachments. I've gone for Renegade Raiders here just for a bit more movement on the ranged units and pinpoint damage on the things on objectives. I think there should be a few points for enhancements left over. In any case though, hopefully that's given a few ideas for helping out with starting a Chaos Space Marine army. Let me know your thoughts on collecting the faction down in the comments below. Certainly look forward to any other tips and tricks from seasoned Chaos Generals. If you'd like some more heretical content to watch, I'll leave links to my Chaos Space Marine Codex review and my Choose a Legion video down in the video description. Feel free to check them out next if you want something else to watch. Otherwise, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I do generally keep the 40k videos coming most days. There'll be plenty more to come on the channel. And finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. If you found these useful, then any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.